All of you come to hear about the first Thanksgiving. It was nigh 40 years ago by now, 20 years. I suppose some of ye had not yet been born. Well, the first part about the first Thanksgiving is why did we celebrate in the first place? Well, I'll tell you, it all comes from a very long voyage that we made a year prior, arriving in November of the previous year in 1620. Well, it had been a very difficult and long voyage, lasting 66 days, but I will tell you, we were on the ship much longer than that. I left from Leiden with my parents, John and Joan Tilley. We left my brother and my sister, John and Rose, back in Leiden. They were both in their 20s and married. And then I had a younger brother also. He was older than I, but still the younger. And he decided that he wanted to apprentice as a weaver. My father had been a weaver, but there wouldn't be much weaving doing here in the New World. So he decided that he would stay in England. So we left him there. Well, so we set out from Leiden. We got on a ship called the Speedwell, and it was to take us from Delfhaven down to Southampton, where we would meet up with another ship called the Mayflower. Well, as it turned out, we went aboard the ship and it had sprung a leak. So we had to wait a week before we could board the Speedwell, but we finally did. We boarded it and we sailed down to the Southampton to meet the Mayflower. And so we did. There was a group coming from Scrooby, England, another part of our sect. You see, the sect had divided because years ago there had been some difficulties in England with our churches being burned and our leaders being executed by the government. They did not approve of our covenanting ways. So we decided that we would leave England. Now, this was the year of my birth, so I don't remember it, but my parents took me with the family to Leiden, and that's the only home that I had ever known up until that point. So we were there, and things were going along well. We'd been there for, I'd say about 10 years, when there began to be some troubles brewing. First, the older children were beginning to grow up, and they were marrying outside our sect into the Dutch community. Well, this wasn't very pleasing to the parents of those young people. Then, too, we had a difficulty with the tolerance that we had been offered in going to Leiden in the first place. You see, when you have religious tolerance, it opens up the door to all kinds of heresy. And people were beginning to preach a salvation by works of prayer. Well, right here in the Bible, in 2 Timothy, it reads, "Who saved us and called us with an holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which was given to us through Christ Jesus before the world was." So tell me, how can you have a salvation by works of prayer? But that wasn't the end of it. King James decided that he was offended by the publications that were coming into England from our printing press in Leiden. Because you see, our elder William Brewster was quite gifted at printing. And he had a press and he was printing out things, sending them back to the English people, all about the Word of God. Well, James decided that he would send over his troops and demolish our printing press and confiscate all of our publications. And that was the last straw. And then it was decided that we would leave Leiden and that we would come to the New World. Well, there were some elderly people in our congregation who decided they couldn't make the trip, that it would surely be the end of them if they came. And so they decided they would stay in Leiden. So it was mostly the young people, the younger families, except for my parents and a few other who were a little bit more of an age. Oh, such as the elder Brewster that I just mentioned before. He decided to come. But most were young people, young families, who decided to go. Well, getting back to the Speedwell and the Mayflower, well, we made it to Southampton. And we were making ready to go. And the Speedwell sprung a leak again. So we had to wait for more repairs, but we finally departed. We'd gotten a little ways out when the Speedwell was leaking again, and we had to turn back and stop at Dartmouth for a bit for more repairs. It's getting later and later in the season by this point, for we had left in July from Leiden, but by this time it was getting pretty close to September. Well, the repairs were made and we set out again. Well, we were 300 miles out to sea, and the Speedwell was taking on water something fierce. So we turned back again, and we docked at Plymouth, and we abandoned the Speedwell. Well, all of our congregation was consolidated into the Mayflower. We had started out with nigh 120 passengers total of our congregation. Well, by the time we actually got everyone consolidated into the Mayflower, we had but 102. And even our pastor, the Reverend Robinson, decided that he would give up his space on the Mayflower so that some other family might be able to take advantage and use his space as passage. And so he told us, he promised us that he would come along later and that we would be in the good hands of the elder Brewster. Well, Elder Brewster would be able to take care of all of our spiritual needs, but there would be no baptism and there would be no Lord's Supper for as long as we had no pastor. It was 3 long years before we did have a pastor again. He was with us for nigh 3 years, and then the very year that our pastor, the Reverend Robinson, died in Leiden, Holland, our pastor too died in Plymouth. So there we were once again without a pastor, depending on the elder Brewster. Well, another 3 years passed before we had our permanent pastor, who finally came, the Reverend Cushman. He was with us for a good while. But we were rather disjointed in the fact that we were so used to not celebrating the Lord's Supper and not having our children baptized as babies. We felt that was very important, that they should become a part of the covenant from the time of their birth. So this was rather traumatic and trying to our group. Eventually, though, very interestingly enough, a pastor by the name of Jonathan Lothrop, a dissenter, one who had been imprisoned in England for 2 full years, had been told that he would be let go free if he would come to the New World and leave England forever. Well, he decided that he would. And so he journeyed across the ocean, and what would he do but appear on our doorstep? Well, his thoughts were not like our thoughts, and when he suggested that we celebrate communion with him, we flatly refused. We were not of like mind in regard to the Lord's Supper, so we sent him on his way. He first went to Scituate and then on to Barnstable. But I must tell you something that is rather surprising. You know, I have 10 children, and one of my children, Hope, married and went on to Barnstable. And today she is actually a member of Jonathan Lothrop's church. But we today are of like mind. there was a pastor by the name of Robert Mather back in England who decided that all Puritans should join together and create the Congregational Church. Well, one of the Puritan pastors already living in New England, a man by the name of John Cotton, got wind of this and decided this was good and this was what we should do here in America: unite the Puritan congregations and make us one. And so we did. And we all embraced the Westminster Confession and accepted the Savoy document to establish our church government. And so it was that Jonathan Lothrop's church and our Puritan church in Plymouth are one. Now, isn't that amazing? Anyway, getting back to the voyage, we did finally leave Plymouth and we set out. We were 66 days at sea in rough weather and storms. You would not have believed the like of it. And one night, my future husband was terribly sick down below in the cabin of the Mayflower, and he decided that he just must go on deck and get a breath of air. And so he did. Well, wouldn't you know it, a great wave came up as the ship was rocking back and forth, and it washed him right overboard. Well, he yelled and he screamed and he just had a complete fit there in the cold, icy water, holding on to a tether. And finally the crew heard him and pulled him back up on deck. If they had not, he would have been the first fatality. But as it is, he's the father of many nations. As I said before, we have 10 children, all of them surviving to this day. At this point, we have 7 that are married. Hannah was our most recent bride. She married in Julie and is just doing quite well. She's now Hannah Bosworth. We're quite proud of her. All of our other children are already parents, and I say that we will soon have nigh 100 grandchildren. Now, getting back to the Mayflower voyage, because I can't seem to make myself stay on track and finish that trip. But we did finally make it. I remember when they called land ho, someone had spotted Cape Cod. Well, this wasn't where we were supposed to be. We were supposed to be in the northernmost reaches of the Virginia colony. And here we were in some unknown place. Well, we decided that since we realized we were not where we intended to be and that our benefactors had given us money to make our trip possible in order to go and inhabit the northernmost reaches of the Virginia colony at the mouth of the Hudson, we had better make our way to the mouth of the Hudson. So we turned the ship southward and we sailed on into huge and terrific storms. We thought we would lose our lives. And so it was decided by our leaders that this was not God's will, that we should continue on, that we should go back to Cape Cod and establish a settlement. And so we did. And by the time we reached Cape Cod, it was the middle of November. One year before we celebrated the first Thanksgiving. Well, our men formed groups of expedition groups. I guess that's what you would call them. And they would get off the ship and they would go on land and they would scout out the different areas, looking for just the right place that we could build our settlement. Well, it actually took until the 25th of December. Now, I know that some pagans celebrate that day as a holiday. They call it Christmas. But we Puritans do not celebrate pagan holidays. We do not celebrate Saints' Days. We do not celebrate Easter. Every Sunday is the Resurrection Day, and we take joy in celebrating that holiday every week. Now, how about that? But anyway, we finally had a place to settle. Now, before anyone ever disembarked from the ship, the men all got together and they signed an agreement that was called the Mayflower contract. They did not know whether or not we were under the laws of the benefactors who had helped to form our company and send us to the New World. We were not where we were supposed to be, and so it was decided that they had better make arrangements to govern themselves, ourselves. And so they did. They all agreed to live in peace and harmony with one another and to remain loyal to the king. And so that's how it was established. So, after we had found the place that we were going to live, the men then formed groups to go and build houses and buildings. They first built the communal buildings. They built a fortification that was later used as our meeting house. They also built 7 houses before anyone ever got off the ship, any of the women and the children. Now, most of the men had come without their wives. They felt that their wives' lives would be at risk, that they wanted a sense of establishment in society before they would bring their wives and their children over. So many of them came later. There were very few girls on the voyage. There were a few older girls. I was one of the older girls. And then altogether there were 18 women and 3 older girls, and then a couple of younger girls, but mostly boys. There were mostly boys. Well, during that first winter, the women were all on the ship, the women and the children. They were not allowed to go ashore because it was just, there was nowhere to live. There was no place for, to be safe from the Indians or from wild animals or anything else. So they stayed on the ship, but it was filthy and dirty, and there wasn't good, healthy food to eat. And so the women began to die. Now, the first woman to die was Dorothy Bradford, Mistress Dorothy Bradford, a precious woman. She accidentally fell overboard into the freezing New England water, and she drowned. That was the first one, and I can't tell you how it demoralized all of the rest of us. It was just a shockwave that went through our group. Well, after she died, then a great illness began to penetrate into the ship. People were having all kinds of respiratory problems and stomach problems. It was quite horrible. I lost my mother. I lost my father. My father was on an expedition. They came back and they told me my father had died. And to this day, I don't really know the details of what took his life. But Mother at that time was sick. I tried to nurse her and take good care of her, but she died. At the end of the winter, before we were able to go ashore and establish our homes, there were only 5 women left and 3 older girls, Priscilla Mullins, myself, and my best friend, Desire Minter. Well, Desire had lost both of her parents in Leiden before we ever boarded the Speedwell. And so she had been taken in by Governor and Mistress Carver. And I am sure that when my mother and father died, it was Desire who talked the Carvers into taking me in as well. And that was quite fortunate because my husband, John Howland, was working for them as their most senior indentured servant. And so, that's how I became good friends with my husband in the first place. So, when we went ashore, that's where I made my home. But unfortunately, when April came around, it was quite hot. The summer had arrived, apparently. And Governor Carver was out working very hard in his garden. And he simply fell to the ground as if in a shock, and died on the spot. Well, Mistress Carver was just taken aback by the situation. She wept as if she had no hope. Desire and I tried to comfort her. We tried to make her realize that there was reason to go on, that there was purpose in living, but she was completely beside herself. We called in the elder Brewster to try and talk to her and pray for her, but it was to no use. And in June, she too died. Well, this was a great problem. My uncle and my aunt had also died during that first winter, and there was but one other relation that I had to turn to. That was a young man whose name was Henry Sampson. But I didn't know Henry, and he was no blood relation to me. And just my own age, how could he possibly help me? And there was a little girl by the name of Humility Cooper. She had been adopted by my aunt and uncle, my Uncle Edward and my Aunt Anne. It had been Anne's little niece who had been orphaned as a baby that they had taken in. Well, it was decided by our elders, our most senior leaders, that Humility needed to go back to England, that she could not be cared for properly in the New World. And so my dear Desire, Minta, decided that she would go back with Humility and find a way to take care of her. And so, in Mistress Carver's dying, my own heart was split completely in two. And I lost my dear friend. I learned a couple of years later when Edward Winslow, Master Edward Winslow, went back to England on an exhibition to try and gather more funds and to get materials and supplies for us. Well, he learned that Desire too had taken ill and that she had also died and that I would never ever see her again. So when my first child was born, I named her Desire. Well, getting back to the voyage, okay, we've gotten back to land. Now, where was I? I wanted to tell you of, the Indians. You must know about the Indians. Well, I never personally had any contact with the Indians. It wasn't the squaws, the females, who came to visit in our village. I never met one squaw. There were only male Indians, braves, who would come and visit, and sometimes the Shechem, Massasoit, would come and visit, but he was only talking to the men, and I was supposed to stay completely out of the way and not have any doings with these savages. I suppose I shouldn't call them that. But anyway, there were 3 very important Indians who had contact with our community. The first one was Samoset. Now, Samoset was from a place called Maine. It was way north of where we had settled, in a place called Kennebec. And so he had come down and he was telling us all about where we lived, and it just happened that the location that we had selected to establish the Plymouth Colony had been the home of the Patuxet Indian tribe. It was a part of the Wampanoag tribe, which Massasoit he's still the chief today. He's still the chief. Anyway, so what had happened with that group, they had gotten a serious illness, and all of them had simply died. And when that place was first discovered by the white man, the English, these people were found just lying exactly where they were. Where they had died, they were none but skeletons. But all had died, and none had been left to bury their dead. So that was where we were living. Well, anyway, Samoset knew of another Indian that he thought could be of help to us. His name was Squanto. Now, Squanto did not die with the rest of the Patuxet, because on one of John Smith's expeditions to the New World, one of his men, a man by the name of Hunt, had captured Squanto, taken him prisoner, and then tried to sell him him into slavery in Spain. Well, a group of friars in Spain got word of the fact that these Indians had been captured and that they were going to be sold into slavery, and they thought this was wrong. And so they got together and they kidnapped the Indians from Mr. Hunt, and they decided that they would train them and turn them into Christians, and then they would help them to get back to their native home. And so Squanto was then, he was trained in English, and they helped him to get a job with a shipbuilder back in England, and he learned English just beautifully. He could speak as well as I can today. He just was a remarkable, intelligent person. And the shipbuilder that he apprenticed with helped him to get on an expedition with none other than John Smith. And so he left his native home with John Smith, and John Smith brought him back. Well, when he came to his village, he saw that it was no longer the Pawtuxet village, it was Plymouth, an English settlement. And so he decided, well, I have none other home than this. And so he asked permission to settle with us there in Plymouth. And so he did, and he lived in our community. Well, he taught us many things. He taught us how to plant corn and use a bit of menhaden in the plantings for fertilizer so that it would grow better. He taught us how to trap eel and how to trap lobster and gather clams and mussels and how to prepare all sorts of different vegetation that grows naturally here in the New World. And he really did do a lot to help us survive. But unfortunately, he wasn't with us very long. It seemed that Massasoit did not trust an Indian brave who spoke such perfect English. And one time when he was in the Wampanoag village trying to negotiate some kind of agreement between our settlement and theirs, they decided they would poison him. And so poor Squanto was given some kind of deadly poison. He just made it back to the Plymouth Colony. He was bleeding from his nose and his mouth and his ears. It was quite horrible. I did not see him, as I said before. When the Indians came around, the women and the children were not to be present. It was something for the men to deal with, not the women. And so I never had any contact with him, as I said before. But anyway, our poor Squanto died. Well, it wasn't long before the good Lord provided yet another Indian to help us and to negotiate for us and to be there for us. And his name was Homobach. And he took up where Squanto left off, although his English wasn't quite so good and he wasn't quite as intelligent, I guess you would say, as our dear Squanto. But anyway, that is how the Lord provided for us. Well, after we had been in Plymouth for about a year, we had been reduced in number to a handful. Perhaps 50 people were living still. On the voyage over, we had lost but one child, a little boy by the name of William. Oh, what was William's last name? I can't remember his last name. Oh, that's so bad. Poor little William died on the trip over. We did have one baby that was born. His name was Oceanus. He was born to the Hopkins. And then we had one more child born after, during the wait, actually, on the ship, another child was born. So we had two born and one died, and then all of these women died, and the men died on the expeditions, and we just shrank and shrank. And we thought, surely we were all going to meet our Maker before we could establish our colony. But then we didn't. By the end of the summer, the 50 who were left were hale and hearty. Our crops were coming in. We had an abundance to eat from, and we had survived. And we decided by the I call him Reverend because he's filled that position so well, our elder, William Brewster, suggested that it would be best if we thanked God with a Thanksgiving celebration. And so we did. So the governor sent out a team of fowlers to go and shoot and hunt, and they came back with a week's worth of fowl. There was turkey and duck and goose and all sorts of things, partridges, enough to feed us all 50